Hello, my name is Helen Webster, and today I'm going to talk about the third book in my Canadian historical trilogy, Company Wife. Now, Company Wife was the third book I wrote, but chronologically, it was the first book in the series. So as the reader, you can decide whether you want to read it first or last. It's the story of my great-grandmother, Maggie McLeod Ross McKenzie. It was an interesting exercise writing this book. When I began, as I always do with my historical novels, I did all the research. I wanted the factual basis for this story, all the events in her life and all the events that were occurring in Canada as she grew older. But once I had done that, and then I began to write her story, it was the strangest thing. I knew her. Now, obviously, she was born in 1850, so she died before I was born. But I knew her. I knew how she would act, how she would think, how she would behave, how she would react to situations in her life. A shadowy great-grandmother became a living woman. I just knew her very well. So I wrote her story. And what I found as I wrote her story, that Maggie, I know she was called Marguerite, that was her birth name, but she became known as Maggie to the rest of the family. Maggie exemplified the courage and the strength that it took to survive in pioneer Canada, especially in the area where she lived for at least 2 decades of her life, which was Northern Ontario. She had a long and fascinating life, our Maggie. She was born in 1850 in Chicoutimi, which is in the Saguenay Valley in Quebec. Now, as I said, this was before Canada was Canada, but Quebec was Quebec at the time. She was the daughter of one of the first settlers in that area, Peter McLeod, and he was a bayman. He had worked for the lessee of Her Majesty's Company, which later became the Hudson's Bay Company in Chicoutimi. So Peter was a bayman. Peter had 18 children, 3 wives, as was common in those days, because the women usually died, worn out with labor and childbearing. Maggie was the first child of his 3rd marriage, as I said, born in 1850. She grew up and she would marry a bayman. This was an arranged marriage. Peter McLeod, her father, had a very good friend, another one of the first settlers of the area, called Simon Ross. They both had children, and they thought, as their children grew up, how wonderful it would be if Maggie married Simon's son, Thomas Barnston. Now, Thomas Barnston was known as TB throughout the story. It was an arranged marriage. That was perfectly normal in those times. But for the first years of their marriage, Maggie and TB were happy. They lived in Metebetchuan, which was a Hudson's Bay fort not far from Chicoutimi. And there she had 5 children. When her youngest, a little girl, was about 3 months old, the Hudson's Bay Company had decided to consolidate their forts in the Saguenay into one main fort. As a result of this, her husband, TB, who had been a clerk in Metebetchuan, discovered that he would lose his job. So he said, well, where can I get another job with the Bay? And he was told that if he was willing to go to northern Ontario, just north of Lake Huron and Lake Superior in the wilderness, he would be a trader. Now that was quite a promotion from his job as a clerk at Metabetchwan, so TB took it. That meant that he, his wife, and his 5 children, the oldest a boy of 9 years, that was Simon, the youngest, a baby of 3 months, would travel from Chicoutimi all the way to Whitefish Lake, which was about 15 miles from present-day Sudbury. Now, Sudbury did not exist at that time. There was no Sudbury, there was no mining, there was no railroad. There was just wilderness. The trip began for the family in Chicoutimi. They took a riverboat down the Saguenay River till where it met the St. Lawrence, and then they turned upriver in the St. Lawrence, still in the riverboat. This was a paddle wheeler, by the way, which allowed it to go into fairly shallow waters, but they passed Quebec City and went on up the river to Montreal. Now, Montreal, the Lachine Rapids are on either side of the island, so of course that was the end of their riverboat journey. However, there was a train at that time that ran from the island of Montreal on into the interior, which was, of course, Ontario. They took the train to Guelph. There they disembarked, spent a day or so, and then took another train that took them to Goderich, which is on the eastern shore of Lake Huron, about halfway up. There they boarded a lake steamer, and they took the 3-day passage right up to the northern part of Lake Huron to Manitoulin Island. At Manitoulin Island, the family disembarked with all of their goods from the lake steamer and were loaded into large canoes called canoe de maître, which is the big canoe that the Hudson's Bay Company used to carry goods. So the family, the goods, all of the supplies that they were going to have to take were loaded. Their paddlers were Ojibwe, and they went across Georgian Bay, heading east to the mouth of the Whitefish River, and up the Whitefish River they traveled. Now, sometimes they traveled in the canoes. When it was too shallow, the canoes were unloaded, put on top of the backs of the paddlers. All the goods were carried on their backs, and the family walked through the bushes. That was their portage. Then when they came to another river or another lake, everything was loaded again, and on they went through bushes, mosquito-ridden swamps, wind and rain. It was a dreadful trip. But finally, after this horrendous journey, they reached Whitefish Lake. Now, I'd like to read you the chapter when they reach Whitefish Lake and Maggie sees her new home. For the rest of her life, Marguerite would remember the profound silence that enveloped the lake and the post. Even the children were quiet, overwhelmed by the absolute stillness that surrounded them. On the shore before them, they saw several small, seemingly abandoned log and stone structures set back from the lake's edge in a cleared area on a grassy slope. On 3 sides of the clearing, the dark forest rose to the sky, with the tall trees dwarfing the post buildings. Marguerite could not contain her gasp of dismay when she realized that the center building, somewhat ramshackle in appearance and no more than a large shack in size, was the house. For a few moments, the family sat unmoving in the canoes, stunned by the silence and the lonely aspect of the small settlement before them. Then the paddlers climbed out of the canoes into the shallow water, and the spell was broken. It was all Marguerite could do to remain composed as the canoes were pulled close to the beach, and she and Christine was her sister, and the children were handed out. As they stood together on the sand, a small man came out of the largest building and walked down to the canoes. This was the trader TB would replace. Darkly tanned and, to Marguerite's eyes, none too clean, he gazed with unsmiling disapproval at the women and children, muttering, "No place for a woman in the wilderness. And with wee ones. The company must have been daft to send ye here. Surprised ye survived the trip." TB had leapt out of his canoe immediately upon landing. He ignored the trader's sour greeting and began to walk with the HBC man over to the post store, leaving his family on the shore. It's all too much, Margaret thought wearily. What am I to do in this God-forsaken place? What was he thinking to imagine that we would be able to live here in the wilderness? There's nothing here, not even a decent house. Then, realizing that her husband was leaving her on the shore, and afraid that the Ojibwe paddlers would leave as soon as the canoes were unloaded, she shook off her moment of helpless despair and, gathering her wits and her children about her, called out to her husband, "Mr. Ross, before you go to the store, please instruct the men to set up our tents and build a fire. We cannot use the house until I have examined it, and I'm sure it will need a thorough cleaning. Also, some of the men can cook our dinner before they go over to their village." Thomas realized that his wife was dismayed by the appearance of the house and the post in general, but nodded to himself in satisfaction as he heard her issuing instructions. He knew that she was angry and upset by the isolation and the condition of the house, but he also knew that, tired and disappointed as she was, Marguerite was immediately prepared to take charge. He was confident that she would soon have everything in order and quickly gave the requested orders to the men before turning back to the trader at his side and continuing his walk to the post store. The boys were simply happy to know that they were finished traveling for the next while and asked their mother for permission to explore this new space. "Not yet. You can explore tomorrow, but for now, do not go into the forest or into the buildings. I want you to go for a swim in the lake. You need to get clean, and it will help with the itching from the mosquitoes. Our supper will be ready soon." The boys stripped and dashed into the water, but it was too cold to stay long. They pulled on their clothes again, and since they had already picked up some Ojibwe words, began running alongside the men, quizzing them as they carried their burdens to the shore. "Are there children in the village? Will they come over here to play with us? Can we visit you in the village?" The men smiled at the enthusiasm of the boys, then nodded yes to all the questions. Maggie and her family lived in the wilderness just north of Whitefish Lake for the next 2 decades. Then her husband, who was always an ambitious man, learned that he could become a junior trader if he went back to Quebec. So Maggie and her 10 children packed up. Now there was a train, the train had arrived, and took the train back to Quebec. Maggie did not want to go back to Quebec. Sudbury had been founded and she was beginning to make some very good friends there. But TB insisted, so they packed up, took the train, because there was a train now, and went back to Chicoutimi in the Saguenay Valley. By that time, and for quite a few years before they left the Whitefish Lake area, TB had become a very heavy drinker. He also was beginning to take out his anger and frustration on his wife, and she was afraid he would begin to harm the children. As well as that, she had to endure the isolation, the loneliness of Whitefish Lake, and the humiliation of his infidelity. So when they came back or got back to Quebec, fearing for her life now and the life of her children as her husband became more and more violent, Maggie made a huge decision. Now I have to tell you, Maggie was born and raised a Catholic, so her decision to leave TB was a big one. However, she did, and entered into a completely new chapter in her long and fascinating life.